Most people never imagined that someone they once trusted could become emotionally dangerous. We are taught to look for obvious villains, loud cruelty, or explosive anger. But some of the most terrifying transformations happen quietly, behind closed doors, in relationships that once felt safe. Narcissistic behavior does not always begin with malice. It often starts with charm, confidence, and intensity that feels flattering rather than threatening. Over time, however, something shifts. The confusion grows. Your emotional reality starts to feel unstable. What once felt like misunderstanding begins to feel intentional. This is the moment many people struggle to name because acknowledging it means letting go of hope, explanations, and the belief that love or patience can fix everything. This is not a conversation about ordinary selfishness or difficult personalities. This is about recognizing when narcissistic behavior crosses a critical line and becomes something far more dangerous. When harm is no longer accidental, when empathy disappears, when power matters more than connection. Understanding these signs is not about judgment, it is about clarity, because clarity is often the first step toward emotional survival. The shift from narcissistic traits to intentional psychological harm is one of the most dangerous and misunderstood transitions in toxic dynamics. In the early stages, narcissistic behavior often appears as self-centeredness, defensiveness, or an excessive need for admiration. While harmful, these behaviors are usually driven by insecurity, fragile self-esteem, and a constant need to regulate internal shame. At this stage, the harm caused to others can feel indirect, almost collateral, as though the narcissist is too absorbed in themselves to fully register the impact of their actions. Over time, however, something changes. The narcissist begins to notice not just that others are affected by their behavior, but that they can actively shape, control, and manipulate those emotional responses. This is the point where awareness develops, and with it, choice. The narcissist starts recognizing patterns in how people react to their words, silence, withdrawal, or approval. They see that confusion weakens others, that hope keeps people attached, and that fear creates compliance. What was once reactive becomes intentional. Emotional harm is no longer accidental, but used as a tool. The narcissist may provoke distress to regain a sense of power or stability, especially when they feel threatened or exposed. Causing emotional pain becomes a way to regulate their internal chaos, not by calming it, but by exporting it onto someone else. As this shift deepens, empathy erodes further. The narcissist no longer experiences others as separate emotional beings, but as extensions of their own needs. When someone is reduced to a function, their suffering becomes irrelevant. In some cases, the narcissist even reframes the harm as deserved, necessary, or educational. This internal justification allows them to bypass guilt entirely. Once harm is morally justified in their mind, restraint disappears. The behavior escalates because there is no internal signal telling them to stop. Intentional psychological harm also brings a sense of mastery. The narcissist begins to feel powerful, not just because they are admired, but because they can destabilize someone emotionally. Watching another person doubt themselves, lose confidence, or become dependent reinforces their sense of dominance. The relationship shifts from connection to control. The narcissist is no longer seeking validation alone, but submission, emotional leverage, and psychological advantage. This transition is often subtle and confusing for those experiencing it. Because the narcissist may still show moments of charm or vulnerability, the intentional cruelty is often minimized or rationalized by the target. But the defining feature of this stage is consistency. The harm repeats, escalates, and follows patterns. When distress reliably benefits one person and diminishes the other, the dynamic has crossed a critical line where narcissism is no longer just a personality style, but an active mechanism of psychological injury. The loss of empathy combined with enjoyment of others' suffering represents a profound psychological shift that deeply alters how the narcissist relates to the world. Empathy, even in limited form, acts as a natural restraint in most human interactions. It creates hesitation, guilt, and awareness of impact. In narcissistic dynamics, empathy is often already impaired, but in earlier stages, it may still appear selectively, especially when it serves their image or helps maintain attachment. Over time, however, repeated reinforcement of power and control weakens even this shallow concern. The narcissist stops emotionally registering the pain of others as meaningful and instead begins to experience it as neutral or even stimulating. This transformation does not happen overnight. It develops as the narcissist repeatedly discovers that causing emotional distress produces tangible rewards. Conflict brings attention. Cruelty creates dominance. Withholding affection increases dependence. Each successful outcome reinforces the behavior, gradually rewiring how they associate suffering with benefit. What once might have felt uncomfortable becomes normalized. Eventually, discomfort disappears altogether, replaced by a sense of satisfaction or relief when they see another person unravel. At this stage, the narcissist's emotional response to suffering changes in a disturbing way. Instead of feeling guilt, they feel energized. Instead of concern, they feel curiosity. They may closely observe emotional reactions, studying how much pain their words cause, how long it takes for someone to recover, or how far they can push without consequences. This is not impulsive cruelty, but a form of emotional experimentation. The suffering of others becomes a source of stimulation, validation, and control. Enjoyment of suffering also serves a defensive psychological function. By watching someone else hurt, the narcissist feels temporarily relieved of their own inner emptiness or shame. Pain is externalized. The more someone else is destabilized, the more powerful and intact the narcissist feels. This dynamic creates a dangerous loop where harm becomes self-soothing. The narcissist does not just tolerate the pain they cause, they rely on it to regulate their internal state. Another critical aspect of this stage is emotional detachment. The narcissist may appear calm, even bored, while others are in distress. This emotional flatness is not indifference but control. Detachment allows them to remain dominant while the other person becomes increasingly reactive and vulnerable. The contrast reinforces their sense of superiority and emotional invulnerability. For those on the receiving end, this loss of empathy is deeply disorienting. The person they once believed cared now appears unmoved by tears, fear, or emotional collapse. Appeals to compassion no longer work because compassion is no longer part of the equation. What remains is a one-sided dynamic where pain flows in only one direction, consistently feeding the narcissist while draining the other person, creating a psychologically unsafe environment that erodes self-worth and emotional stability over time. Escalation from manipulation to calculated cruelty marks a point where harmful behavior becomes structured, intentional, and increasingly dangerous. In earlier phases of narcissistic dynamics, manipulation often appears reactive and chaotic. The narcissist may lie to avoid accountability, gaslight to protect their image, or withdraw affection when they feel slighted. While damaging, these behaviors are usually driven by emotional impulses rather than long-term strategy. Over time, however, repeated success teaches the narcissist that manipulation can be refined, timed, and optimized. What once happened in moments of anger or insecurity becomes planned in advance. This escalation begins when the narcissist starts anticipating reactions rather than responding to them. They learn what destabilizes someone most and deploy those tactics deliberately. Silence is no longer accidental, but used to create anxiety. Affection is given just enough to prevent detachment, then removed to regain control. Words are chosen not to communicate, but to wound in specific ways. The narcissist may wait for moments of vulnerability, stress, or joy before striking, ensuring maximum emotional impact. Calculated cruelty also involves predictability on their side and confusion on the other. The narcissist maintains a calm exterior while delivering harm with precision. This contrast is intentional. Emotional neutrality gives them control while making the other person appear irrational or overly emotional by comparison. The cruelty is often subtle, hidden behind plausible deniability. Sarcasm, backhanded comments, or selective memory allow them to hurt while avoiding responsibility. When confronted, they deny intent, shifting blame and deepening confusion. Another defining feature of this stage is the escalation of consequences. The narcissist no longer settles for momentary control, but seeks lasting psychological effects. They aim to erode confidence, independence, and self-trust over time. By repeatedly undermining reality, they create a dependency where the target doubts their perceptions and relies on the narcissist for validation. Cruelty becomes cumulative, with each act building on the previous one to weaken resistance. This calculated approach also reflects a loss of emotional spontaneity. The narcissist is no longer reacting emotionally, but observing strategically. They may appear detached, patient, even thoughtful, which can be deeply misleading. This calmness is not maturity, but intent. They are conserving emotional energy while the other person expends theirs trying to understand, fix, or appease. For those experiencing this escalation, the most confusing aspect is the contrast between early charm and later cruelty. Because the narcissist still occasionally shows warmth, the calculated harm is often rationalized as stress, misunderstanding, or temporary change. But the pattern reveals the truth. When harm is delivered consistently, strategically, and without remorse, the behavior has moved beyond manipulation into deliberate cruelty. This stage is especially dangerous because it traps the target in a cycle of hope and harm, gradually eroding psychological safety, autonomy, and self-confidence until leaving feels nearly impossible. Dehumanization of the target as a coping and control mechanism is one of the most chilling shifts in narcissistic dynamics because it allows sustained harm without internal conflict. In the beginning, the narcissist may still perceive others as people with emotions, needs, and boundaries, even if they regularly override them. Over time, especially when accountability threatens their self-image, this perception becomes inconvenient. Seeing someone as fully human would require empathy, responsibility, and restraint, so the narcissist unconsciously strips those qualities away. The target is no longer a person, but a role, an object, or a resource designed to meet psychological needs. This process often begins subtly. The narcissist stops using language that acknowledges individuality and instead speaks in labels, assumptions, and projections. The target becomes difficult, dramatic, weak, ungrateful, or disposable. These labels are not random. They serve to flatten the target's complexity and erase their inner world. Once reduced to a stereotype, it becomes easier to justify mistreatment because the narcissist is no longer responding to a human being, but to a distorted narrative they have created. Dehumanization also functions as a coping mechanism. Narcissists carry deep internal shame and emotional fragility that they cannot tolerate consciously. When the target reflects discomfort, anger, or hurt, it threatens to expose this inner instability. By dehumanizing the target, the narcissist protects themselves from emotional contamination. The other person's pain becomes meaningless noise rather than a signal that something is wrong. This emotional distancing allows the narcissist to remain psychologically intact while continuing harmful behavior. Control is strengthened through this process. When someone is no longer seen as human, their boundaries lose significance. Their exhaustion becomes irrelevant. Their needs become inconvenient obstacles. The narcissist feels entitled to access, attention, obedience, and emotional labor without reciprocity. Resistance is interpreted not as self-protection, but as defiance. Punishment then feels justified, even necessary, because in the narcissist's internal logic, objects do not have rights. This dehumanization often coexists with intermittent kindness, which makes it even more destabilizing. The narcissist may temporarily restore humanity to the target when it benefits them emotionally or socially, then withdraw it again when control is threatened. This inconsistency creates confusion and emotional dependence. The target spends immense energy trying to earn basic recognition and respect, unaware that the problem is not their behavior, but the narcissist's perception. As dehumanization deepens, cruelty becomes easier and more efficient. The narcissist no longer pauses to consider impact or consequence. Emotional harm feels abstract, distant, and inconsequential. The target's distress may even feel annoying or intrusive rather than alarming. This is why conversations feel circular and repair feels impossible. You are trying to be understood as a person by someone who no longer experiences you as one. The absence of remorse, even after clear harm is exposed, is a defining indicator that the narcissist has crossed into a profoundly unsafe psychological space. In earlier stages of harmful behavior, there may be moments where the narcissist appears apologetic or regretful, especially when consequences threaten their image or access to supply. These apologies are often shallow, defensive, or conditional, but they at least acknowledge that something went wrong. Over time, however, even this performative remorse disappears. The narcissist no longer feels compelled to pretend that the harm matters, even when it is clearly articulated and supported by evidence. When confronted with the impact of their actions, the narcissist at this stage does not reflect inward. Instead, they deflect, deny, or attack. Accountability feels intolerable because it threatens their fragile self-concept. Admitting harm would require acknowledging imperfection, vulnerability, or wrongdoing, which they experience as psychological annihilation. Rather than tolerate that internal discomfort, they reject responsibility entirely. The pain they caused becomes irrelevant compared to the threat to their identity. This absence of remorse is often paired with intellectualization. The narcissist may calmly explain why the harm was justified, exaggerated, or necessary. They may minimize the damage by reframing it as a misunderstanding or accuse the other person of being too sensitive. These responses are not confusion but defense. By redefining the situation, they protect themselves from guilt and maintain a sense of superiority. The emotional reality of the victim is dismissed as invalid or manipulative. What makes this particularly destabilizing is the clarity of the harm. By this stage, the damage is no longer subtle. Emotional breakdowns, loss of confidence, anxiety, or withdrawal are visible. The narcissist sees these outcomes and continues anyway. This is the critical shift. The harm is not hidden, accidental, or unknown. It is fully visible, and the lack of remorse signals that the suffering of others no longer registers as morally significant. In some cases, the narcissist may even express irritation that the harm has been brought up at all. The conversation itself is perceived as an inconvenience. They may accuse the other person of dwelling on the past or trying to control them through emotion. This reaction reveals a profound disconnect from relational responsibility. The expectation that harm should be addressed is rejected entirely. For those experiencing this absence of remorse, the most painful realization is that explanation no longer leads to understanding. No amount of clarity, emotion, or evidence changes the response. The narcissist is not struggling to understand the harm. They are choosing not to care. This realization often marks the end of hope for repair and the beginning of the need for self-protection, because a relationship without remorse has no mechanism for healing, accountability, or emotional safety. The increased danger when accountability no longer matters is what turns a harmful person into a genuinely threatening presence. Accountability is one of the last remaining restraints on destructive behavior. Even individuals with severe narcissistic traits often modify their actions when consequences become real, whether those consequences involve reputation, abandonment, or loss of control. When accountability stops functioning as a deterrent, the narcissist is no longer regulating behavior through fear of outcomes. At that point, nothing external slows them down. This shift usually happens after repeated experiences of getting away with harm. Each time the narcissist lies, manipulates, or hurts someone without facing consequences, their internal belief system changes. They learn that rules do not apply to them. They begin to see boundaries as suggestions and consequences as negotiable. Over time, this creates a sense of psychological immunity. They feel untouchable, above reproach, and entitled to act without restraint. When accountability no longer matters, escalation becomes inevitable. The narcissist takes greater risks, pushes further, and tests more extreme behaviors because there is no internal or external signal telling them to stop. What once felt risky now feels safe. What once required justification now feels automatic. Harmful actions no longer trigger anxiety about fallout. Instead, they may trigger excitement, confidence, or a sense of dominance. This stage is especially dangerous because the narcissist no longer responds to confrontation, exposure, or consequences in predictable ways. Being called out does not lead to reflection, it leads to retaliation. Accountability is interpreted as an attack rather than a boundary. The narcissist may respond with rage, smear campaigns, increased cruelty, or calculated punishment designed to reassert control. The goal shifts from maintaining the relationship to winning, dominating, or destroying opposition. Another critical change is the loss of corrective feedback. Healthy behavior relies on feedback from others to adjust and repair. When accountability is dismissed, feedback is no longer integrated. The narcissist does not learn from harm because they do not recognize harm as relevant. This creates a closed system where behavior becomes more extreme over time, unchecked by empathy, guilt, or consequence. For those involved, this is the point where logic and negotiation fail completely. Appeals to fairness, reason, or mutual respect have no effect because the narcissist does not share the same framework. They are not operating within a relational system, they are operating within a power system. The relationship becomes unilateral, with one person enforcing reality and the other absorbing damage. This loss of accountability also explains why separation often triggers the most dangerous behavior. When control is threatened and consequences still do not matter, the narcissist may escalate further to regain dominance. This is why recognizing this stage is critical. It signals that the situation is no longer emotionally unhealthy, but structurally unsafe, requiring distance, protection, and firm boundaries rather than discussion or repair. When narcissistic behavior evolves into these darker stages, the most important shift is not in their personality, but in your understanding. What begins as confusion, hope, or self-doubt must give way to clarity. These signs are not isolated incidents or temporary lapses in behavior. They form a pattern that reveals intention, awareness, and choice. At this point, the question is no longer why they are this way or whether they can change, but what continuing exposure is costing you psychologically and emotionally. This conclusion is not about labeling someone as evil for dramatic effect. It is about recognizing when empathy has disappeared, accountability has collapsed, and harm has become normalized. When someone knowingly causes suffering, justifies it, and escalates without remorse, the relationship itself becomes unsafe. No amount of patience, explanation, or love can repair a dynamic where one person benefits from the destruction of the other. Clarity is what breaks the cycle. Once you see these signs for what they are, you stop internalizing blame and stop chasing understanding from someone who has none to give. Protect